Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Looks like a few people have been following the news. I'm Judy, President and CEO of the San Diego Natural History Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. Before we begin, I have a few reminders. Please turn off your cell phones or anything else that's going to make any noise. And photography, audio, and video recording are not permitted. Please also note the emergency exits behind you, and then there are some behind me as well. Thank you for joining us this evening as we continue to share the news of the fascinating Cerutti Mastodon site. First, a little background. In 1992, museum staff member Richard Cerutti and other field monitors were working on a routine paleontological monitoring job on a Caltrans freeway improvement project when they came across some mastodon bones that looked a little unusual. The specimens have been the subject of intense research efforts over many years, and as you know, and as you've probably heard by now, the discovery has turned out to be the earliest evidence of human activity in the Americas. The results of this research were published in the journal Nature last week. The discovery underscores the importance of paleontological mitigation work and laws to protect these resources. It also speaks to the importance of museum collections and ongoing scientific research in our area that continue to yield clues to our past. Tonight we're going to explore the story in much more detail. First, we'll watch a brief video that discusses the story of the discovery. Then we'll hear from Dr. Tom Demarais, Museum Curator of Paleontology and Director of Paleo Services. Very long title. Afterwards, we'll moderate a panel discussion, including Q&A from the audience. Before they get started, I'd like to acknowledge all the authors of the paper, many of whom are here with us today. Can all the authors not on stage tonight please stand up? Well, let's get all the authors up. We've got a whole front row here. We've got Richard. After tonight's talk, we welcome you to visit our new display on the second floor. We're telling the story and displaying some of the specimens that were found at the site. If you can't stay this evening, please come back and see the display, which will be on view through Labor Day. So we're going to begin tonight with some classic 1990s footage of the field paleontologists. Check out the short shorts and the big video camera of our field paleontologists and researchers at the Cerutti Mastodon site.
In November 1992, paleontologists from the San Diego Natural History Museum were conducting routine monitoring of a construction site on State Route 54 here in San Diego, when field paleontologist Richard Cerutti spotted several fossil bones and portions of a tusk. It took 22 years to piece the story of these fossils together, and the picture it reveals just might change everything. As Cerutti explored the site with Dr. Tom Demarais, they found fragments of distinctive molars showing that they had discovered the bones of a mastodon. But something was puzzling. Many of the bones were strangely fractured or missing entirely, and there were several large stones that seemed out of place in the surrounding fine-grained sediments. To Richard, this was starting to look not like a paleontological site or a fossil site, but instead like an archaeological site, like the preserved evidence of human activity. As work on the site continued, questions about its age remained unanswered. At the time, the oldest evidence of humans living in North America came from sites that are around 14,000 years old. But mounting evidence suggested this site was much older, possibly dating to long before any humans were thought to have arrived on the continent. The first step to solving this riddle was to confirm that the site was, in fact, an archaeological site. Dr. Steve Holland had the expertise to help. Using the femur bones of recently deceased elephants, Holland had conducted two separate experiments in which he demonstrated that a stone used as a hammer causes fresh limb bones to fracture in a distinctive way. No known geological process or animal scavenging produces the same fractures in bones. In 2008, when Holland first traveled to San Diego to study these specimens, he confirmed the same breakage patterns. Furthermore, the San Diego site had 5 large rocks that could have been used to produce the breakage. The broken bones were concentrated in 2 separate clusters, each around 1 rock. The other large rocks lay nearby. Could these have been used as tools? To help answer this question, the team consulted Dr. Richard Fulliger, an expert in use-wear features on stone tools. Richard compared the impact and wear marks on the stones found at the San Diego site with other stone tools. Sure enough, the large stones showed the same abrasions, fractures, and scars that only occur on stones used as hammerstones and anvils. No known geological process produces the same patterns of wear. A clear picture was starting to emerge of 2 distinct areas where early humans were using rocks to break bones and teeth. But couldn't a flood or other event have rearranged the rocks and bones? Holin, who has studied sites where this happened, says no. At other sites, gravity sorted bones by density and size. This wasn't the case here, where everything from small molar fragments to large rocks were distributed, unsorted, around the site. The researchers were unanimous. They had uncovered an archaeological site containing portions of an extinct mastodon. But a critical question still remained unanswered. How old was the site? In 2011, almost 2 decades after the mastodon's discovery, advances in technology provided the answer the team was looking for. Tom Demarais sent several of the mastodon bones to Jim Pacey's, who used state-of-the-art radiometric dating methods to determine their age. The mastodon bones, which were still fresh when broken with stone tools, were around 130,000 years old. What does this mean? It means that early humans were living in North America at least 115,000 years earlier than previously thought. This site's discovery reframes our understanding of when humans first arrived on this continent. It also raises as many questions as it answers. Who were the humans at work at this site, and how did they reach North America? Were they an early, failed attempt to colonize a new part of the world? Where are the other sites that show human activity in North America that are as old as this one? Where else should scientists look for evidence? Asking questions is at the heart of scientific discovery. Science is always seeking the best explanation that fits the evidence when new information is uncovered, no matter what we thought was true before. Fossils tell stories. This is not the end of this story, but simply the beginning.
Wow, that's it's interesting to see yourself age in 5 minutes like that. I had to come over here. These are some interesting relics from the past we'll talk about in a little bit, but this has been an adventure, and certainly this last week has been an adventure. And we've had some interesting responses, to put it mildly, to our publication in the journal Nature. I was happy to see, though, that the Union Tribune, after carefully researching the subject, came up with a plausible reconstruction of our site. That didn't work, did it? I never did like this thing. Alexis, this controller, oh, there we go. Kind of spoiled the moment, but I think this is a terrific form of flattery when you make the editorial page of the local newspaper. I should point out it's a slight exaggeration, because we found no human remains at this site, which is important to realize, and we'll talk more about that in the Q&A. And we only found the remains of a single mastodon, not a whole traffic jam of mastodons. But we did find it adjacent to a freeway, and it does kind of give you a sense of what's going on. But certainly the most startling aspect of our research is the age of the site, at 130,000. This thing is not working. Are we going to have to do that where I say advance the... Alexis, thank you. Maybe somebody could get me a clicker that works. But anyway, so we're proposing 130,000 years, and you know, as indicated. The currently widely accepted view of the earliest dates for humans in North America are about 15,000, maybe 20,000, but we're talking an order of magnitude older. It's a big number, and it's a bold claim, and it's something that we can talk about more in the Q&A. I'm not a geochronologist. But next slide, Alexis, please. As the video indicated, the site was discovered during mitigation paleontology, which means paleontologists trained in recognizing fossils in the field and recovering those fossils in and amongst bulldozers and scrapers. It's a delicate balance, and Richard and Brad, who's here tonight, and Paul, who was out on the site too, are really terrific at that sort of activity. And it was in this setting that these fossils were found. The Caltrans was widening the freeway, building overcrossings and on and off ramps. And in the course of that, cutting in through a 20 to 30 foot thick section of Pleistocene or Ice Age sediments that were deposited in a fluvial setting, a river setting near sea level. And we were collecting remains, or they were collecting remains of a variety of Ice Age mammals, and this site was contacted. So next slide, please. And there's been some suggestion that the site was damaged by bulldozers and so forth. Well, the fossils and the rocks were contained in a siltstone stratum about 20 to 30 centimeters thick. If you think of this as a book laying on its side, and instead of pages in the book, you have this terrific assemblage of fossil remains. The excavator just tagged the very edge of the book of this bone bed. And the bulk of the bed was undisturbed and excavated by hand. And you can see the top of both of these images, the layer above the bone bed is undisturbed. So this is a sealed site, and in the process of excavating the site, we were very diligent to excavate this with strict taphonomic protocol, where we, using datum marks, were able to measure precisely horizontal and vertical placement of each of the bones that we collected from the site. So it was a very tedious project, and this excavation operations for this site extended over a 5-month period during a very wet El Nino winter, 92, 93. There we go. I have the power. And this is the pattern that emerged from that. So we excavated 50 square meters of this bone bed. This is a plan view. And each of those squares is a meter on the side, so roughly 3 feet on the side. And the blue color indicates bones of the mastodon, a single individual. The yellow objects are teeth of the mastodon, both molars and tusks. The green objects are clasts of andesitic metavolcanic rock, and the red objects are clasts, both cobbles and fragments of those cobbles of pegmatitic or granitic composition. And so that's the general lay of the site. And if you think of this as a prehistoric crime scene, right? And it's all the evidence is laid out in front of you. The shell casings over here, the blood spatter over there, but in this case, bones of this single individual mastodon and its teeth, and these really odd associated cobbles, 5 large cobbles, and an otherwise really fine-grained sandy silt. So this is the pattern that we were presented with. And this is a schematic or parts list for a American mastodon. Dan Fisher produced this wonderful way of summarizing, in this case, what we found and, more importantly, what we didn't find. And you can see we have parts of both tusks, we have upper and lower molars, we have 3 thoracic vertebrae, and we have 1 caudal vertebra, and partial and whole ribs on both the right and left sides of the rib cage. Almost nothing of the forelimbs. The hind limbs are represented by a few elements in the feet, but and portions of both femurs. But I should point out that if you look at the femurs, we have really just the heads of the femurs and fragments of the shaft. And if we look here at my feet, we have a femur of a Columbian mammoth that we collected in Oceanside in the San Luis River Valley, fossil. They don't live today, but that gives you generally the sense of the size of this leg bone, and all we really found were, as you'll see, fragments of this bone as well as the head of the femur. So an incomplete mastodon, and again, this crime scene kind of way of thinking of it, just begging for some explanation. And what I wanted to do is just kind of go through some of the more unusual aspects, taphonomic aspects of this site. So we have, as the video indicated, we have 2 concentrations. So it's not a homogeneous distribution of evidence, but there's this clustering. Concentration 1 is referred to it, and concentration 2, and each are centered around andesite cobble. And all of these, or the majority of these objects you can see in the exhibit upstairs, so it gives you a good sense of well, you can see firsthand what they look like, okay? So we have this interesting concentration of bone, broken bone, and broken rocks, roughly centered on these cobbles that we interpret as anvils. A solid, resistant surface that you can put a bone on and then take another rock and break that bone. So we have anvils. We also have hammers. So this is the really exciting thing of this crime scene, is that we have not only the anvils, but we have the hammerstones. And as Richard Fulliger has pointed out, it's not that we just have hammers and anvils, but we have this hammer, which broke that bone on that anvil. You know, and so we can reconstruct in our mind's eye this scene set 130,000 years ago. So I wanted to talk about a couple of other interesting anomalies. We have this one, which is a tusk. Now we have one of the tusks here. It's still in its field jacket. This is the tip of the tusk. The rest of it is back in there, but it's been damaged. This is one of the parts of the excavation that was damaged by the excavator. But without that damage, Richard would never have found it. So this explosion of ivory resulted in the discovery of this site. So that's one tusk, but it's vertical. We're going to look at that a little more closely, and then we also have this pairing of the detached heads of both femurs found in this cluster in the concentration 1. We have a spirally fractured piece of one of these leg bones. And in that cluster, we have an interesting pattern that emerges of these robust bones that are broken and the more delicate bones, like several of the ribs and vertebrae that are intact. I mean, if we're talking purely geological processes, you would think that the lighter, more delicate bones would be broken differentially compared to the more robust bones. And then we have this hammerstone we're going to look at in a little more detail. So here's the tusk. This is what it looked like in the field, just a circular outline, but this is what it looked like in cross-section when it was excavated, extending from the bone bed down into the underlying strata. It's an interesting pattern that, again, begs for some explanation. In this case, it doesn't fit any plausible geological processes to have this odd orientation for a tusk. Here are the 2 detached femur heads. You can see them in the exhibit upstairs, sitting side by side, again in this concentration. Another very odd arrangement of bone that doesn't fit with let's say, a non-cultural process. And then we have these wonderful 3D animations that Dan Fisher and Adam Roundtree and colleagues at the University of Michigan have done. This is one of the spirally fractured fragments of the femur. The upper image is colored, and the lower image is the grayscale to give you a better sense of the topography, surface topography of the specimen. And then we have Dan's modeled a hammerstone and then an anvil here, and we'll just set this in motion. I hope. Alexis? And by the way, if you go to the Nature's website, you can play a bit with these animations. And if you go to the University of Michigan's UMorph site, you can have a more intimate encounter with these beautiful 3D these 3D models of these specimens. So the sharp, spirally fractured, smooth planes of fracture on this bone are characteristic features of percussion. And if you look at the hammer, you can see that yellow spot is indicating the point of impact on those bones. And then here's this differential breakage I was talking about, these rather fragile ribs and vertebrae. Again, this differential breakage is suggesting selective harvesting of those parts of the skeleton that are most useful for making bone tools. And this is another animation that I think beautifully illustrates one of the cobblestones that we found in the site. And there we go. Again, same thing, a grayscale modeled at the bottom. So this is a roughly 30-pound cobble that's been put back together. When I say put back together, you'll see in a moment all of these pieces. And what's really exciting about this, and they refit beautifully. I mean, it's part of the same cobble. There are even crystal faces in there. When we look at the distribution in our crime scene, we see that those fragments are here in concentration 1. We've removed some of the extraneous thing around the anvil, and they refit with the cobble, which is here 10 feet away. Again, what we're proposing, this hammer was used to break a bone on that anvil. Pieces came off of it. It was a poor choice for a hammerstone because of its internal structure. It's coarsely crystalline. And the cobble itself is over here. So we're proposing this as a bone processing site where early humans were processing bone for either marrow extraction or for raw material to produce bone tools. It's not, and you can repeat after me, this is not a kill or butchery site. So, and that's an important distinction that we'll talk about more in the Q&A. Okay, so it's not that, but it is that, and then I just wanted to acknowledge the following organizations and individuals for helping support the original excavation and keeping the dream alive, so to speak, as indicated here. And with that, I'm going to put back our crime scene map so that we can talk more about it as we proceed with the next phase of this program, which will be a Q&A time, a panel discussion, and my fellow authors, several of them will be up here, and we welcome your questions and comments.
Yeah, if we can bring the other authors up to the area, we'll do some introductions. I'll start off by introducing myself. I'm Dr. Michael Wall. I'm the Vice President of Research here at the San Diego Natural History Museum. And I am ashamed to say that in all of my career, I've never taken one geology or paleontology or archaeology class. So not quite the best choice for a moderator, you might think, but it might be the perfect moderator because I'm going to be able to ask the questions that other people might not ask because they wouldn't know they were stupid questions. All right, so first off, I'd like to introduce all the authors that are up on stage. Of course, you've just met Tom Desmarais. He's our Curator of Paleontology and Director of Paleo Services here at the NAT. Sitting next to him, we've got Dr. Steve Holen, who is the Director of Research at the Center for the American Paleolithic Research. Next to him, we've got Dr. Richard Fulliger, who's a professional research fellow at the Center for Archaeological Science at the University of Wollongong in Australia. Next to him, we have Dr. Jim Paces, research geologist in the Geosciences and Environmental Change Science Center for the U.S. Geological Survey. And at the end, Dr. Daniel Fisher, professor of paleontology at University of Michigan, where he also serves as the director of the Museums of Paleontology. So we've got some pretty respected folks up here on the stage to talk to us about this amazing discovery tonight. And what I actually want to start off with is not hearing from them, but from hearing from you. We're going to do a little bit of crowd participation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some statements, and I'm going to ask you whether or not you accept those statements, reject those statements, or are still open to thinking about those statements, okay? And there'll be a smattering of you who are content experts or out there that are going to quibble with me about the details of my statements. You're going to say things like, well, I accept that clause, but not that adjective. And this is not a test, okay? What we're really trying to do is get a feel of the temperature of the room regarding two things that I feel like are most crucial about this study. So question number one, and then we'll do a show of hands kind of thing. Question number one, or statement number one, is some sort of human relative, early human of some sort, was present at this site concurrently, i.e. at the same time, as a living or recently dead mastodon. So all of you who accept that statement, raise your hand.
No, that's good.
Okay, all of you who are reject that statement, raise your hand, and it's okay. We're all about skepticism here at the museum. We're going to talk more about that later. Okay, how about people who are reserving judgment on that? All right, I'd love to see those hands. We're going to talk specifically about you in just a second. In a very positive way, don't worry. So question number two. The bones recovered from this site are somewhere between 120 and 130,000 years old. Who all accepts that statement? Raise your hand. All right. How about those of you who reject that statement? It's okay to reject. Okay, who's reserving judgment? All right, good for you guys. All right, so we're going to come back around to that. But I see my role tonight as to help all of you, particularly you that are reserving judgment, to actually pick a side. Because science is the pursuit of the truth. There is truth at this site. There's some truth there. And these authors are seeking that truth. They've developed evidence to seek that truth. And so our role as listeners here tonight is to evaluate the evidence that we're going to hear about and try to pursue that truth for ourselves and see how we walk away at the end of the night, how we feel about the evidence that has been presented to us. So I've been poring over the coverage of your guys' discovery, and there's been a lot of it, if you haven't noticed, after you've talked to people ad nauseum for the past 74 hours. And I'm going to be asking questions based on the comments that I've seen in the media or via Twitter or even on Reddit. Wherever I could find someone discussing this topic. And what we're going to do is I'm going to develop a conversation with the authors. We're going to do that for about 20 or 30 minutes max. I promise no longer than that. And then we're going to go out to you, the audience, to ask the questions that are on your mind. Okay? So everybody got where we're going? So a few news outlets have spoken to someone named Dr. Tom Dillahay. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Is that correct?
Yes.
And for the audience's reference, if you're not familiar with Dr. Dillahay, he's a renowned archaeologist at Vanderbilt University who himself has kind of felt the sting of archaeological controversy when he first suggested that a site in Chile was just 4,000 years older than what was previously the 10,000-year age for a lot of the Clovis sites. So he felt the sting of controversy for 4,000 years. Can you imagine the sting of controversy around 115,000 years? And so Dr. Dillahay is paraphrased in a National Geographic Online article as saying that this paper, your guys' paper, does not satisfyingly rule out the possibility that natural processes carried the large rocks to this scene, nor does it fully rule out the possibility that the wear patterns on the stones were the results of rocks bumping against one another in a stream. Now, I don't want to start with the wear patterns on the rocks. I just want to start with the fact that they were there. These large rocks were there. So let's start with that. And Tom, if you can start us off with this, can you address some alternate hypotheses for how these large stones could have gotten to the scene and why you rejected those hypotheses? And feel free to cast out to your fellow authors.
Well, the alternative hypotheses are that the rocks were transported there, but by a geological process like flowing water. However, the stratum that the fossils are found in and the cobbles themselves are found in is very fine-grained sandy silt, and the hydrologic flow of a stream, or the velocity of a stream carrying silt versus the velocity of a stream that's carrying cobbles that are weighing up to 30 pounds is really quite distinct and separate. And the fact that those are found together suggests that flowing water is not the process that is depositing all of these together. That there's some other process that's involved. And since we don't have glacial ice rafting these clasts out over a riverbank, it's not happening there.
Actually, I've excavated 3 mammoth sites in the Great Plains where water has transported skeletal material, and you can see the high energy deposits that these bones were moved in, and the bones were moved in very distinctive patterns. One mammoth died on a point bar deposit in a stream. It dried out, it started falling apart. A small flood came along and washed certain elements over the end of the bar over into a little plunge pool. Those were the molars they're kind of round, one of the big toe bones that are kind of round, and some tusk fragments that are kind of round, so things that would roll with the water flow. As we went back on the point bar deposit farther, we got the big limb bones that the water couldn't move. So it's a completely different kind of pattern that we see here. So I've excavated 2 other sites with, kind of one was a spectacular flood, and we found 14 or 15 mammoth teeth that had moved far downstream along with tusk fragments and so forth. And so it's a very different pattern, and that was, things were all jumbled and stacked and, strange angles. So it looks nothing like this whatsoever. So, my experience is this could not be caused by a flood.
And I might add, if our co-author Jared Beaton was here, who's a quaternary geomorphologist, which means he studies the landscapes that developed throughout the quaternary, and a lot of the sedimentology involved with the sites, he would say that our crime scene consisted of an overbank flow deposit. So it was receiving very low energy silts and sands, perhaps during floods, but as backwaters, not in the active channel. You would have to get an active channel kind of energy situation to transport the large rocks. The differential between the mass of the rocks and the mass of the sediment itself is very, very large. Tom did not excavate. The excavation did not go out into the channel, so we only assumed that it was farther away from the deposit. So there's really no geologic way to get those two very, very contrasting types of sediment together.
And I should add that Jared Beaton actually worked on 2 of the mammoth sites with me that were in these flood deposits, and he's our project geomorphologist, and he could even tell you better about this if you were here.
Great, thank you guys. So let's ignore how the rocks got there for a minute and focus more on this other Delahaye critique about the actual modifications to said rocks. And I know, Richard, you're a resident wear use analysis person on the project. Are there alternative hypotheses to explain the patterns on these rocks? I mean, how does one tell the difference between possible human wear versus rocks that are bumping around in a landslide or flowing down a river?
Okay, well, there's 2 things to that. One of them is the context, and the other is the actual nature of the wear itself. And the context, as has been explained in answer to the previous question, indicates that massive movement of these artefacts by water or any other process that we can think of isn't on. We can't think of another explanation that can arrange these things in the way that they're arranged. And if they haven't been moved, then we have to treat the evidence as we see it. And as we see it, you can pick up one of these rocks and look at it macroscopically, and you can see chips off the edge, you can see jagged edges, sharp edges, and pitting, all of the things which are characteristic of a stone-on-stone impact, which is in fact what the critic has indicated. But they've suggested that this thing happens in a stream or a river system, and there are in fact old rounded weathered scars on these cobbles. They have spent some of their life in a high energy stream, but there are also fresh jagged marks along the edges of the hammers and along the anvils, which indicate that it's happened very recently. And as you've seen, we can actually fit bits of the hammer back together again, which indicate that it must have happened at that point. The other kind of wear that we can see on the edge, microscopic wear, are small scratches and a kind of polish on the edge of the surface where the hammer has hit the bone and then maybe slipped off and been forced over some irregular surfaces, which we can see on the anvil stone. And these parts of the anvil stone have the same kinds of jagged edges, impact marks, and flake scars that we can see on the hammer. Furthermore, parts of the anvil have actually flaked off, and we can refit those bits back onto the anvil. So an explanation that involves damage in a stream doesn't fit the evidence when you can actually fit the pieces back together again.
And I'd like to add that my research partner, Kathleen Holan, who's also my wife, we have done 2 experiments breaking elephant bone with these big hammers, a little bit which you saw in the original movie. And we sent these hammerstones to Richard, and we also broke some cow bones. We sent the hammers to Richard, and he looked at the use wear patterns on the hammers that were used experimentally to break bones, and the wear patterns were the same as on the ones that the hammers that we see in the Cerutti Mastodon site.
Exact match, that's right.
Yeah, so let's actually come around to the work on the bones. We've been talking about stones. Let's talk about the bones a little bit. In the bone breakage patterns, it suggests that these early humans were using anvil and hammer stones. So in the Atlantic, Professor Dr. Ariana Burke, a paleoarchaeologist up at the University of Montreal, admitted that the fractures were consistent with bones that had been struck by a heavy object while they were still fresh. But she goes on to say, but it's not clear if humans did the striking, and goes on to contend that the problem is that by focusing only on those fractures, the team hasn't published information on the rest of the bones, which might reveal several signs of weathering or other natural abrasions. And so can you sort of discuss this critique of the analysis of these other areas?
Do you want that one, Dan? Or you...
I certainly can, yeah. Though I would say this is something that is as much Richard's area as mine here. I suppose what she's saying is that we've cherry-picked the evidence and only shown the evidence that fits our model. Well, we've shown the evidence that we found. We've looked at the pieces that were associated with one another, the flakes near the anvils, the flakes that refit on the hammers, and the elements of a single structure have a single kind of damage on them. And it's one pattern, it's not many patterns. We didn't have to pick just one and ignore a raft of other material or styles of damage. I think focusing on many of the bones are actually quite well preserved. For instance, another idea that we had to consider carefully and reject was the possibility that the remains of this animal had been trampled. Elephants trundling by, stepping on bones, sure, that could easily break bones. But the bones that would be most easily broken by that mechanism would be things like ribs and vertebrae. They were dominantly unbroken at this site. And the bones that were most broken were these heavy limb bones, like this femur that's laying out here beside me. That femur is hollow. The solid core that forms the real structure that supports the animal's weight is a good 2.5, in some places 3 inches thick. That bone that's tougher than the best sledgehammer handle you've ever had. I mean, it's really difficult to break that. You saw, or at least maybe got a sense at how hard Steve had to work with his long hafted stone hammer to finally make the first crack in that elephant femur. So an elephant stepping on a femur would be hard pressed to break one of those bones. Certainly not when the bone was fresh. Beyond that, we looked for signs of trampling. Trampling is a very well recognized characteristic pattern of scarring, sort of random pits, many of them running parallel, sometimes even curving in parallel, as an animal sort of spins and slides its foot across the bone surface. None of that. So this seems to be a surface that was not heavily affected by the behavior of such animals. Elephants are unusual. They're even known to go around. They'll often recognize the bones of their own dead family members. They'll come along months, sometimes years later, and say, "Oh, this is where Martha went down." And they tend to pick up the bones very carefully, handle them with their trunks, and set them down again. They don't bash them, let alone pick up rocks and bash them.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No.
I was going to say, with respect.
Carry on.
With respect to the idea that it wasn't human, it may have been elephants, we did get one theory which we hadn't considered before, and that was that a capuchin monkey had picked up these. And if you look at the weight, reconstructed weight of something like 18 kilograms, one of these stones, this capuchin monkey's picking this thing up, and this is baggage you check in, 18 kilograms. It's not carry-on, and they're hovering above the head of another creature, another capuchin monkey holding the bone on the anvil. And we hadn't thought of that one.
That's true.
So the other thing that has been suggested, and maybe that's what this person is asking, is that large carnivores broke these bones. Every paleontologist that I've ever talked to said there's no carnivore that ever lived in North America that could break these bones at mid-shaft, including the giant short-faced bear, which is a huge bear, much larger than a grizzly bear. So, they can chew on the ends a bit, but they can't break a bone at mid-shaft. We thoroughly looked at all the bones. These guys are paleontologists. They look at bones all the time, and there's absolutely no evidence of carnivore gnawing on this bone. So we can eliminate carnivores, another one of the possible natural causes. So I think we pretty well eliminated all the natural causes that we know about that could break these bones, which leaves us with humans. And we know, based on experiments, based on study of Clovis age mammoth kill sites where they break the bones in the same patterns, we know that humans do this and can do this experimentally.
Great, thank you guys. Jim, I can't say this for sure, but I'm guessing that if you all had dated this site around 10,000 years ago, that there wouldn't be quite as much controversy as we're having right now around these findings. And it is the dating of these materials that has caused a lot of the delay in the eventual publication of this as technology developed. And I know that the team used at least 2 other dating methods before arriving at the uranium-thorium technique that you're an expert in. Can you sort of walk us through those dating techniques and what they told us, and then eventually how the uranium-thorium gave us a final conclusion?
Sure, Michael, thanks. I'm a quaternary geochronologist, and so that sort of means that I specialize in trying to establish the ages of geologic materials that are less than about 500,000 years old or so. I was brought into the project by Steve in around 2012, although Tom had attempted to do some geochronology when the site was first found. And the results of some of those efforts were incorporated in the original 1995 report. The first thing anybody does when they have bones, especially in this country if you're dealing with archaeological sites, is to use radiocarbon. And that's something that Radiocarbon is produced in the upper atmosphere by interactions between nitrogen and cosmic rays, solar energy. And there's this constant rain of radiocarbon down that we breathe, that we eat, that every living thing incorporates into its tissues. When that organism dies, it no longer is accumulating new radiocarbon, so the clock starts at that point. It's good for about 40 to 50,000 years if it goes to completion. The problem here is that they couldn't even get a radiocarbon date off of this because there was no organic matter left in the bones. It had all been decayed away. Not decayed, I shouldn't use that word, but the organic material had been decomposed. So the results came back undateable. Some very early dating, which was quite speculative at the time. The ages themselves had large uncertainties, and there was just a couple of attempts at several different bones. They came up with a very old age, but people weren't really putting much weight behind that. In around 2000, the middle 2000s sometime, Tom and Steve tried to get somebody to come in with a technique called luminescence dating. And that technique is used on the sediments that are encasing the bones. And what they're really looking at there is there's electron traps that hold electrons metastably. If you subject quartz crystals, in this case that's what they like to use, quartz sand grains, to an external dose, which is essentially uranium, thorium, or potassium decay, that will ionize and kick those electrons into these metastable traps. With time, they take that back to the lab, they look at the light given off from when those traps are cleared out, and the amount of light that they measure can be used to date the material if you know what the dose rate was in the ground. Problem with that is that there's only so many traps that can accumulate these electrons. And so they become saturated. So no matter how long that material sits in the ground, it's not going to accumulate any more signal. So in this case, that technique maxed out at about 60 to 70,000 years old, and pretty much all they could say, it had to be greater than that. So they were looking for a better technique, something that was within the range, extending beyond that. And Steve knew that I was working on a site up in Snowmass, Colorado, the Snow Mastodon site. Asked me if I wanted to try these bones out, and I agreed. I use a method called uranium series disequilibrium, which looks at the decay of natural uranium that's incorporated into the bone. And by looking at its composition today, we can back calculate how long it took in order to get to that composition and come up with an age. So the methods that we were using were dramatically improved from the original early 90s methods. We also have a much, much better understanding of how uranium in a natural environment interacts with bone materials. So a lot had advanced in that time period. And it took me a couple of years. We started out with just a couple of scoping studies to see how it went, but a total of probably 100 analyses on a number of different specimens before we finally decided that we had enough information that we could confidently say that the bones themselves that were broken when they were still fresh, they were 130.7 plus or minus 9.4 thousand years old. And that's 95. We feel 95% confident that that uncertainty covers the total range. People will try to replicate that. Tom will get requests from other folks, and I can't predict exactly what they get, but my real guess is that it will be within that window of uncertainty that we have come up with. And I might also add that there's some. The reviewers said that the method was proven and sound, and we've not gotten much blowback from the geochronological community on that date.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the dating is that, and you'll have to remind me what the name of the fluorescence technique was again.
It would be optically stimulated luminescence.
Optically stimulated luminescence. That at least gave you a minimum age, right, of 60,000? Is that what you got at? Which still is a long time ago. But then on top of that, we've got this very well-supported evidence that points at 130,000 years ago as well. So, Steve and Dan, I think this is in your wheelhouse, but anybody else feel free to jump in. I've seen a number of people critique the fact that there are no naped stone tools at the site, that those are missing from the site. I saw one person that was even quoted as even claiming that this was unheard of at confirmed archaeological bone processing sites. Were you guys at all surprised by the lack of naped stone tools, and is this the only known bone processing site that is lacking them?
Well, Michael, you've just demonstrated that you've never had a course in archaeology. Those are called napped stone tools, which means people use flint napping techniques to shape stones out to make like hand axes or different things like that. So yes, we're getting some blowback on that, and that's because people don't read the article before they talk. Okay. And seriously, my wife Kathleen and I did an interview yesterday on Science Friday, and the woman who was critiquing this said, well, why don't you have napped stone tools, or chip stone tools, we call it, like hand axes and things like that? She said, every kill and butchering site, you find those. Yeah, and we didn't get a chance to rebut this much, but Kathleen jumped right on that one and said, well, we say directly in the article that this is not a kill and butchery site, okay? So, that's what people aren't reading. They're just not reading the whole article and understanding it. This is not a kill and butchery site where you would expect to find, like a knife made out of a stone knife, a hand axe, or, sharp cutting flakes and things like that. You don't need that at this site. We think this carcass decomposed quite a bit before people came along, and the only thing that they did at this site was to break the bones, maybe for marrow, and probably for taking pieces away for tool manufacture. There's a lot of pieces, big, thick pieces of the femur missing, and we're pretty sure that humans took those away to make nice. You can actually chip this thick bone. People in Africa, 1.5 million years ago, figured this out, and they were making, there's a Acheulean hand axe in Africa that's 1.5 million years old, and at sites around Rome and Italy where there's not very good or very big pieces of stone, they were taking elephant limb bones and flaking out Acheulean hand axes. So this is a very old technology. It's well known. It's been back in human evolution for a long time, and it's spread out of Africa and all across the world and into the New World. This technology is nothing new and different. It's very easy to understand. What? And my wife, Kathleen, could you give her the mic? She always says, I always forget things, and she catches me.
I just want to point out there are tools at the site. They're expedient tools. They're hammers and anvils.
Right. And people just can't understand, a lot of people think you have to have a chipstone tool to have an archaeological site. And we've been arguing this for years because we've excavated these mammoth sites out in the Great Plains with the same fracture patterns, but we don't have any stone tools with them, not even hammers and anvils, actually. And we say you don't have to have a chipstone tool to have an archaeological site. You have to have definitive evidence of human technology, and that's what we have at this site, and that's what we have at our sites in the Great Plains.
Perfect, thank you. Another thing that has popped up from multiple reviewers is the broken tooth. Why break a tooth? There's no marrow in it.
Well, that's a good question, and I really have puzzled over this since we started on it. But I have found 2 sites in the world where people have used tooth enamel to make tools out of. One is a site in China that's about 120,000 years old. And I think it's probably maybe thick rhinoceros tooth enamel, if I remember correctly. And then at the Monteverde site in South America, the site that's about 3 years older in Clovis, maybe
3,000.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and
3,000.
Yeah, and there they have used a type of Mastodon that lives in South America, and they've used some tooth enamel to make little cutting or scraping tools down there. So that would, even though we don't understand this very well, that would be the best explanation, because the tool stone around San Diego, I understand from Richard Cerutti, is not the greatest for making stone tools, and so maybe you supplement it a little bit by using some tooth enamel. That's the only reason I can think of to break a molar open.
Might just add that teeth don't have marrow in them, but they do have dental pulp, and that is also a nutritive tissue. So it could have been a twofold matter. Grab a bite of pulp, now let's break it and use some of that tooth enamel. It's very thick enamel on Mastodon teeth, and the fragments that we've observed actually go through the enamel and into the dentin. And the combination of those two tissues gives you a sort of two-phase material, something to grab and something that's sharp and cuts.
Interesting. Okay, so one last question before we're going to go out to the audience. And in the Q&A so far, I've highlighted a lot of your critics, but you do have some supporters. There are a few of them out there.
Thank goodness.
And in particular, there's Professor Dr. Bonnie Pitblado, a paleoarchaeologist at University of Oklahoma, posted an open letter on her Facebook page that she sent to the Atlantic. In the very first sentence of the last paragraph, she said, "For me, this is science at its most beautiful." And I think just a round of applause for that right now. Now, she was also cautious about upending a long-held paradigm, but she was also said that we should be equally cautious in rejecting well-reasoned studies that don't fit that paradigm. And so, if you would, if any of you could speak to or comment about your group's approach to skepticism in the process of science, going through this entire process that probably brought a lot of doubts into your own mind.
Dan.
This actually came up in discussion at supper here, out in the gathering place, and someone asked virtually the same question, and I said, we appreciate skeptics, we just want rational skeptics.
Fortunately, I'm a paleontologist and not an archaeologist, and as a paleontologist, I view this as a speciation and dispersal event from the old world to the new world, and I'm frankly puzzled by the emotional reaction that we're getting from some archaeologists, because I mean, if you think about it, our genus evolved in Africa, dispersed or speciated, because we're finding new species of Homo every year, if not every week now, but and dispersed out of Africa, adapted to different environments, found their way to Australia eventually, and eventually to North America. 130,000 years ago, we're coming out of the MIS 6 ice age, coming into the extreme interglacial warming of MIS 5. The land bridge is open, bison are crossing, humans are curious, humans are hungry, humans are dispersers. Why not follow the bison? It's just surprising to me that as a paleontologist, I often wondered, well, why aren't humans here? That's, to me, a bigger question. But again, getting back to what Dan was saying, I look forward to honest and considered evaluation of our results. And you can imagine we were very skeptical of this too, but I mean, we have this scene behind us. We have this evidence that's crying out for an explanation that's rational, that fits with our understanding of the natural world and how it works. And we pursued alternative hypotheses, and we kept coming back to humans. And then Jim ruins it by saying it's 130,000 years old. And we say, well, we have to follow the evidence no matter where it leads. And And as Tom Delahaye actually said, he commended us for having the courage to stick our necks out. But fortunately, many of us are old enough that it doesn't matter anymore.
I would comment to that. I'm sort of semi-retired. I only work for my wife, who's the director of our small research center. So nobody's going to fire me. So that the other thing that I'd like to say is, and I'm going to say this to Richard from Australia, before this discovery, the Americas were considered to be the last continents occupied by early humans. Now, you're last, Australia.
Well, rather than comment on that comment, no, well, yeah, I think Tom and Steve and everyone has been aware that we've worried about this and been sceptical for sort of a 20-year period, and the rest of the world's had a couple of days to worry about it. And it'll take a while, I think, to actually, work through all these bits of evidence. And there have been some positive comments that have come through. Rather than a criticism, people have pointed out a problem that we're aware of and we're thinking about, and that is that gap between 135,000 years ago, 130,000 years ago, down to 25,000 years ago. And there is an apparent gap in that record. Now, some of us on the team will argue that that gap is only apparent and that gap can be filled, and probably rather sooner than anyone thinks. There are potential other localities out there and sites, and it's a question of looking for certain classes of evidence. So although all the criticism hasn't been good, and some of it has been bad, there's been some very positive comments on it, which we're aware of and we're thinking about as well.
And I should add, 4 reviewers for Nature really put us through the task, and their comments made this Nature letter a lot better. I mean, we had to really revise this. We brought in Richard from Australia and spent 4 days here looking at all the stones, not just a couple of them that we sent him before. So they really made us do our work, and they made it a lot better. And we assume, we only know one of the reviewers who signed off, but these people are leading scientists in the world. I mean, and so this thing, a year-long review process is tough, but it makes things a lot better, and we really appreciate their efforts.
That's right.
I might add, as my part of this, that skepticism is absolutely essential in science, and replicating results is absolutely essential. And we're not all heating our homes with cold nuclear fusion. If we would have believed a couple of people back in the middle 80s that was a viable process. But people have suggested, will we need to rewrite textbooks at this point? And absolutely, this is an exciting stage to be in. Is it the oldest site that will be found eventually? Maybe yes, maybe no. I think it just needs to go through the standard scientific scrutiny process. And maybe 10 years from now, maybe 5 years from now, it'll be time to rewrite the textbook, but certainly not now.
Exactly.
All right, we are now going to go back out to you, the audience, and the way we're going to do this is I'll point somebody out. If you can kind of project towards me, then I will repeat your question because we are streaming this live, and we want the people who are watching from home to be able to hear those questions. And then the authors will take a response. And so there's a gentleman in a blue shirt back there.
Processing site, I worked in 54 at the west end of it, building storm drains when it was being built. And were you able to open up that stratum any further, get an excavator to go any further in that stratum?
So the question is, the gentleman was working in this area at the time, and when they were doing the dig, were they able to dig farther into the stratum other than within the area that is outlined here?
Well, this site had many positive aspects going for it, and one of which was location. It was on the north side of the right-of-way, away from the freeway. It allowed us to be there 5 months without really affecting the construction schedule. It was, again, deeply buried, as I indicated earlier. And this stratum extended into this hillside, and we excavated, as you see there, about 5 meters, about 16 feet into the slope. The stratum is still there. The rest of it, what we didn't excavate, we were running out of material and running out of time. But we also felt that we had recovered a beautiful sample of what was in that particular stratum. Whether or not there's more there, but that stratum still extends, but we were not able to pursue it to its to daylight, so to speak.
I might also add that if you look at the top, the distribution kind of stops very quickly at the top. There was a housing development several years before that had destroyed the site on the other side of the fence.
Yeah, that's true. No, by the way, no mitigation paleontology at that one. That's where they would have been better off having the museum there looking. Right?
Okay, question from the man in the black shirt. So let me repeat the question. At that time in northern Eurasia, what species of Homo would have been there, and what was the technology that they had, and would have it felt similar to this?
Well, in southern Siberia, Homo neanderthalensis had been there at least 150 or 200,000 years. And then there's the new group called Denisovans that are known from 2 teeth and 1 finger bone that they've got DNA out of, and that's all we really know. I mean, we don't have any other physical remains of those people. So those are the 2 groups that during the warm periods surely could have extended their range north and possibly came across the Bering Land Bridge. The other possibility is an archaic form of Homo sapiens in China. We know they were there sometime between 80 and 120,000 years ago, so that's another possibility. And the 2 ways in are across the Bering Land Bridge before maybe 130,000 years ago, when the warm period set in then and melted the glaciers and flooded the Bering Land Bridge about that time. So they couldn't get in by land after that. So they would have had to come in before about 130,000 years ago by land. The other possibility is by boat. We now know that humans had watercraft that were able to cross significant open water. They got to Crete by 130,000 years ago. There's never been a land bridge to Crete. And they got to the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia 118 to 190,000 years ago, and they would have had to get there by watercraft. So if you can cross significant, 20 or 30 kilometers of open water to get somewhere, you can surely follow the coast of Asia to the north when it warms up, and then come down the west coast of North America using watercraft. So those are the 2 possibilities, and those would seem to be the best possibilities of which species of Homo made it here.
I'd just point out that with that crossing of to Flores, some arguments have been that it would be accidental and maybe they rafted across. But the thing is, with that drowning land bridge, it's not just somebody pulls the chain and it's suddenly flooded. It would have been a gradual process. And there would have been possibilities of small necks of lands and islands and things that required quite short distances and then longer and longer distances. And the use of boats, Steve's absolutely right. At the stage, you would have had to have boats, but it would have been a gradual process, and there would have been other, something in between the boat and walking. Yeah.
A question from over here. Yep, in the gray shirt.
So the tusk that was found in the near vertical positions, is there other examples in established archaeological sites of that type of phenomenon? What would explain that?
Okay, so the question is there was one tusk that was discovered at the site in a near vertical position, and is there any examples at other established archaeological sites of that and what that might have reflected?
I've been trying to track down a reference. I've heard that people that built the mammoth bone houses in Eastern Europe may have set bones into the ground and used them for work platforms, but I haven't been able to find the reference for that yet. So the answer is I don't know for sure, but it's not a common thing, that's for sure. I've never seen it before. Is anybody else?
Dan?
I've not seen a tusk vertically inserted into the sediment, but I do have a mastodon site in Michigan. It's actually bones preserved in the shallow well, in the sediments at the bottom of a shallow pond, basically. It seems that humans at the time brought carcass parts to a pond and intentionally submerged them to store the meat. And at the margins of these clusters of bones that were stored in the pond with the intention of returning to them to recover the stored meat at a later time, they would take the main axis of a spruce tree and they pushed that spruce tree down into the mud, and I suspect that it once extended above the water level. And it would have then been a marking post that would have said, oh yeah, that's where we put the carcass parts, out there. And they would then go back and fetch them when they needed them. So there are 2 clusters, each with one of these marking posts associated with it. Wood, not tusk, but it's something comparable.
Back here, the brown shirt. Yeah.
Where were the fragments from the Hammerstone found? Were they found near the anvil or near the Hammerstone?
The question is, where were the fragments for the Hammerstone found? Were they near the anvil or where? We might need to go back a few slides.
Have you got that?
Do you want me to do that?
Pointer got
Yeah, where's the pointer? No, we don't have to come back.
Oh, whoops. You had that one.
Can you do it?
The upper one.
Oh, there we go. Righto, so that's the Pegmatite Hammerstone here, and all these red bits around here are parts of that hammerstone that struck that anvil and broke down and can be refitted. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, to me that proves right there that water didn't carry them over. They were strung on that Hammerstone, it broke off that anvil.
Yeah.
I think the authors like that interpretation.
Yeah.
Did you say that again?
Can we cite you?
Yeah. You're hired.
Yeah. We got a question up here in the front.
I'm curious as to the evidence that supports the intervention was that long ago versus you said there was fresh bones. What's the evidence to support that was done when the bones were fresh rather than much later?
Okay, so the question was the human intervention with these bones, what's the evidence to support that it was while they were fresh instead of much later?
Well, the evidence is that when bone breaks when it's fresh, you get what's called spiral fractures, and the fractures spiral around the bone like this, and the planes on the fractures are very, very smooth. Once a bone sets out for a while, it starts to form drying cracks, and then once you hit the bone with a hammer, once it starts to form drying cracks, the fractures follow those cracks. So we know that this bone was very fresh. There weren't any drying cracks on it before they hit it, and the fractures spiral around the bone. Also, we have these little things. We have the impact notch, and we have the cone flakes that form in a concentric circle around the point of impact. They're very diagnostic. We reproduce them when we hit elephant bone or when we hit cow bone with a hammerstone, and you can only do that on very fresh bones. So this bone was quite fresh when it was broken, but the animal, we think, was probably had laid out there and rotted quite a bit, and they were just salvaging the bone, and they were not butchering the animal.
In the back, the person holding up the crutch. Oops, sorry about that. Yeah.
Just something quick to add to this. Among ourselves, certainly, we talk all the time about how the fracture forms that are produced by when this fresh bone is struck with an energetic impact are so very diagnostic. At the same time, the shapes themselves are matters of subtle curves, and it can be really tricky to see these. I mean, even if you're holding the specimen in your own hand, let alone seeing an illustration in a journal article. And so one of the things that we did in order to make the shapes of these things more accessible to readers, including certainly our critics, our peer reviewers, was to make 3D models of the individual specimens. And it's those 3D models that were then incorporated in animations. I think you saw a couple of those, but some of the cobbles and as well as some of the individual artifact models. These subtle forms are best viewed on our University of Michigan online repository of fossils, or UMorph website, which you can visit. And there's now a banner that will take you directly to a Cerutti Mastodon page, and you can look at these individual models and mouse over them and turn them this way and that and zoom in on them and really appreciate for yourself the subtleties of these three-dimensional forms. But for those that don't have that sort of access to it, I brought another sort of supporting specimen here this evening. These are 3D printed versions of some of our critical specimens. This one in particular is printed at 3 times actual size, which you might think, am I just trying to make it bigger than it really was? No, it's just so that it's easier to see, even from a distance. There are some of them that were bigger specimens that we had to print at half actual size because they were too big for our printer otherwise. But the point is that, that these specimens, if you know what to look for, there are these very subtly curving shapes. Those are the features that actually carry the information, that this has to be a spiral fracture. This has to have formed when the material was fresh. This has to have formed from energetic impact right there.
Thanks. Sir?
Are the andesite and pegmatite stones that you found at all unusual for the area? Are there other examples found there, or can we learn anything from that?
So the question is, are the andesite and pegmatite stones that were found in the area unusual in any way relative to the other stones that one might find around that area, and is there anything we can learn from that?
Well, actually, those rock types are common in the foothills of the Peninsula Ranges. In fact, the andesite metavolcanic rocks, andesitic metavolcanic rocks, crop out at the Sweetwater Dam, which is not too far from this site, and are incorporated as class into both the modern Sweetwater drainage and its tributary drainages, as well as to in these Pleistocene river systems as well. And so these are being transported from the east. They're undergoing stream transport and as bed load and being rounded in the process. And all of these class indicate, and I think Richard already talked about this, indicate that they had been transported by streams in active channels with under high flow conditions. But so they're readily available, and we think of a Pleistocene MacGyver moment for these early hominins, and they have this problem to solve, and that's they have a carcass that's decomposed, that's not useful for meat, but it is a source of raw materials to produce bone tools. You want to break those bones, you look into the active channel, which is not too far probably from this, or at least within walking distance from this overbank setting. You grab a couple of large boulders, you carry them back as manuports. I believe that's the correct term. I'm learning this archaeological language. And you bring them back to the site and you use them. So they're expedient tools, but are found in the local drainages, again, being transported from outcrops to the east.
Sir, up here in the...
Well, we know that the discovery site was fortuitous. The California Environmental Quality Act had you guys on the scene. In order to find a second or even third corroborating type site, do you think that's going to require luck, or is there some strategy that can be devised to try and locate corroborating sites?
So the question is that this initial site was sort of surreptitiously discovered. It was by accident, and is there any sort of kind of plan that one could put into place to try to focus down on other areas to find corroborating sites?
Well, yes, there are actually. A research design would be, first of all, the possibility that humans are here in deposits that are 130,000 years old. So with that in mind, you want to focus your attention on rocks of that age, and using our understanding of the distribution of geologic deposits here in the coastal plain, San Diego County, coastal San Diego, but up and down the coast, obviously, these people didn't just come to San Diego like us and stick around, right? So, our research design expands to the strategy would be to look for deposits of this particular age, and also of a depositional setting such as a fluvial system like this that would potentially preserve those remains. But that's the challenge going forward, and that's the exciting part of this. You know, the beauty of construction mitigation for us is that the deposits are fresh when we get to them. It's not like you have to wait for weathering and erosion to expose these and in the process damage the actual remains. I mean, here you have fresh exposure. The bulldozers can be our friends, and with talented field paleontologists like Richard and Brad, the opportunity is there. But yeah, it would be wonderful to be in a spot where we could excavate without the pressure of a construction schedule that is forcing us to hurry it along. But we will start looking, and we encourage our brethren to take up the challenge to adopt perhaps this paradigm shift that we can now start looking in deposits of this age for, again, as you mentioned, corroborating evidence.
Right here in the middle. Tori? Yep. So the question is that if the mammoth, in some sort of injury, obtained its own spiral fracture, would we not have this same sort of evidence that we found?
Yeah, yes, we all fracture bones, and we all have spiral fractures when we fracture them, and mastodons and mammoths are no different. But what we see here that's really more diagnostic are the impact notch and the cone flakes that form around it, and the fact that these limb bones are broken into dozens of spirally fractured pieces, which you wouldn't expect, if something just naturally broke its leg. And both femurs are broken into multiple spirally fractured pieces. So yes, animals do break their bone in spiral fractures, and spiral fractures are not necessarily diagnostic of human interaction with the animal, but these other features are, and the fact that it's really fragmented is very indicative of human breakage of limb bones.
There were rocks to stumble over.
Yes, we got the rocks that did it.
Dan, did you want to add to that?
Well, I think Steve has really covered it pretty much.
Okay.
I'll just make a sort of simple anecdotal addition to this. We were traveling in China, visiting our daughter who lived there, and unfortunately my wife had a bicycle accident, took a cartwheel off over a tall embankment, landed on a rock wall, and broke one of her femora into about 6 pieces, all spirally fractured, but only one femur.
Oh, yes.
That is, an animal would generally be incapacitated by that one break.
We've got multiple questions up here in the back. I'm going to go first to the person with glasses and possibly a blue shirt. Okay, I believe the question is, was there evidence of scavenger damage on the bones themselves, and is there any way that scavengers could have been involved in the spiral fracture damage?
I'm happy to answer that one. There was no evidence of scavenger activity on these bones. When scavengers, and by here I presume we mean, let's start really at the beginning. There are your large avian scavengers, such as your condors. They don't have teeth. They don't wield tools. They just have beaks and talons. They can tear away meat. So they really don't leave much of a trace on bone. Your other scavengers are things like big wolves and the Pleistocene dire wolves. Certainly the largest bear was the short-faced bear. There were also big cats. Including hyenids, actually, during part of the Pleistocene. But all these animals have very particular ways of attacking a bone. They know where a bone is weakest. They know where they can go to maximize their energy input per time spent getting it. And we do not see any modification of the parts of the bone that they traditionally and characteristically and just basically always attack. Their activities yield particular types of scooping. Typically they go in from the ends of the bones. That's not where, those parts of these bones are still intact. They haven't been modified in the way that scavengers generally modify them. The kinds of things that we're looking at, these notches, these cone flakes, which we can't, I know we haven't talked about them much, though a couple of the things that I showed you here were cone flakes. They're tricky to realize, but once you learn to recognize them, once you learn what their signature means, they are evidence that there has been an energetic impact from above that has smacked the side wall of the tube of structure that is the long shaft of a limb bone, and that a conical plane of fracture has radiated through the wall of that limb bone, and it's been then separated into these characteristic pieces. That is not something that any of these carnivores do. So we see a type of damage that none of them do, and we fail to see what is their signature type of damage.
All right, we're going to have one more question from the gentleman on the exact back row. So to repeat the question, there was a schematic, the parts diagram that Tom showed up earlier in the presentation showed that there were a lot of bones that were actually missing from the site. So what's the story with the rest of those bones?
Well, the first answer is, as I mentioned before, everything from the top of the map on that direction, which would be north, was removed by a housing construction project several years before this excavation took place. So that's where probably quite a few of the bones are. Certainly, we know that they broke both femurs on the one anvil, and the fact that there are major pieces of the shaft of both of those femurs missing, we interpret that to mean that humans took those away to make bone tools with. So that would answer part of the question. We really don't know for sure how much of the skeleton was taken away by the house construction.
We just don't know. That's what we found.
Yeah.
And it's a good question, and we've puzzled over it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we also have down here, which is still in the hill. With that patchy distribution, there's always that possibility that there's more of the skeleton at this site. We just haven't found it yet, but we don't know.
Well, if we can take some time to congratulate and applaud our scientists that are all here tonight. I have to agree with Dr. Bonnie Pitblado that I do really feel like this is science at its most beautiful. The way in which these scientists have collectively executed the analysis of the evidence and rejected various hypotheses and finally arose to a conclusion that was the simplest explanation for everything that they could find is truly the basis for science. And proud to have them here at the Nat, and Steve looks like he's got something to say.
I would really like to thank everyone at the San Diego Natural History Museum for making this the culmination of my career.
You too.
And I'd just like to say you can't get out of this that easy.
We have more work to do.
Yes, that's what I wanted to hear. Okay.
So I planned on going through the exercise of seeing whether or not you agreed with the statements or disagreed with the statements, but I think what would be much more interesting is for you to go up to the exhibit, which is on the second floor, evaluate a little bit more of that evidence. The authors will be up there for you to have a chance to ask them some more questions, and then as you're driving home tonight, ask yourself those same questions. Do you believe that humans were here at that site concurrently with mastodons? Do you believe that that was 100,000 years ago? Does the science bear that out? And that is the process of science. That's what we do here at the NAT. That's what we're very proud of. And we're always happy to have you with us. So thank you for coming tonight.
Isn't it? Oh, yeah.